Picture, if you will, a street where the morning mist clings to empty door frames like the breath of ghosts. Elmira Lane, 1912, where 13 families once called home, where children's laughter echoed off cobblestones, where the scent of fresh bread drifted from kitchen windows. Now only silence, not the comfortable quiet of a neighborhood at rest, but the suffocating hush of a place abandoned by the living. The official records speak of departures of families seeking better fortunes beyond the valley. Deathbed confessions whispered of something far more sinister, something that transformed neighbors into predators, something that fed not on strangers, but on trust itself. What investigators would eventually uncover was not the work of wandering madmen or wild beasts, but a horror that had been hiding behind lace curtains and Sunday smiles. Before we go on, tell me in the comments where you are watching from. If this is your first time here, subscribe because the story I am about to tell goes beyond anything you can imagine. This was not merely crime. This was a systematic harvest of human lives, orchestrated by those who should have been protectors, carried out under the very noses of a community that chose blindness over truth. The entire block went missing, and the most terrifying part was not how it happened, but how long it took anyone to notice. To understand how 13 families could vanish without a trace, you must first understand the place that swallowed them. Blackwood Mills was not a town in any traditional sense. It was a machine designed to extract lumber from the ancient forests of Hemlock Valley, and everything within its borders served that single grinding purpose. The mill owners had constructed their empire in the most isolated corner of the territory they could find. Towering mountains ringed the valley like prison walls, their peaks shrouded in perpetual mist that rolled down through stands of hemlock and pine, so dense that daylight barely reached the forest floor. The only way in or out was a single dirt road that wound through 20 miles of wilderness, a road that became impassable for months each winter when the snows came. This isolation was not accidental. It was carefully engineered to create a workforce that had nowhere to run. The company owned everything: the houses where families slept, the store where they bought their necessities, the school where their children learned to read company-approved textbooks. Workers were paid not in currency but in company scrip, worthless paper that could only be spent at company establishments. The social hierarchy was as rigid as the mountains themselves. At the top sat the mill owners, invisible titans who visited perhaps twice a year from their mansions in distant cities. Below them, the mill superintendent ruled with absolute authority over every aspect of daily life. The workers formed the base of this pyramid. Families crowded into identical wooden houses that the company had built in neat rows along streets, with pastoral names that mocked the industrial reality of their existence. Elmira Lane sat at the heart of this controlled world, 13 modest homes lined up like dominoes waiting to fall. Each house was identical to its neighbors, painted the same company green, fitted with the same iron stoves, the same narrow windows that looked out onto the same cobblestone street. The uniformity was deliberate, designed to prevent anyone from standing out, from drawing attention, from questioning the order of things. In winter, the valley became a sealed tomb. The road disappeared beneath snowdrifts taller than a man. The river froze solid, and the perpetual fog thickened into a gray shroud that muffled sound and swallowed light. It was during these months of enforced isolation that the residents of Blackwood Mills learned to keep their suspicions to themselves, their fears locked behind doors that opened only for company business. The mill whistle marked their days, its shrill cry echoing off the valley walls at dawn, noon, and dusk. When that whistle blew, men hurried to their shifts, women tended their small gardens, children played their supervised games. Order was maintained through exhaustion, through debt, through the simple fact that there was nowhere else to go. But in a town built on such rigid control, even the smallest deviation from routine became magnified, whispered about, feared. When families began to disappear from Elmira Lane, the community's first instinct was not to investigate, but to explain away, to maintain the illusion of normalcy that kept their fragile world from crumbling completely. What seemed like simple poverty and isolation hid something far more unspeakable, a truth that would challenge everything the residents of Blackwood Mills thought they knew about the neighbors sleeping just beyond their thin wooden walls. Before the silence descended upon Elmira Lane, it had been a street alive with the rhythms of working families making the best of their constrained circumstances. The Henderson family occupied the house at number 7, where Margaret Henderson hung her washing on a line strung between 2 maple saplings, and her husband Thomas returned each evening with sawdust in his hair and stories for their 3 young children. Little Sarah Henderson, barely 6 years old, was known throughout the neighborhood for the bright red ribbon she wore in her blonde curls, a splash of color that seemed to defy the company's preference for muted tones. The Miller family lived at number 12, their home distinguished by the small vegetable garden that James Miller had coaxed from the rocky soil behind his house. His wife Anna was renowned for her sourdough bread, the aroma of which would drift through the lane on Sunday mornings, drawing neighbors to linger on their porches just a little longer. Their teenage son Robert helped his father at the mill, learning the trade that would likely define his entire life, while their daughter Mary practiced piano on the battered upright they had somehow managed to transport from their previous home. Between these families and the others that filled the lane, there was a sense of community born from shared hardship. Children played together in the narrow street. Women shared recipes and remedies. Men gathered on stoops after their shifts to discuss the day's work and the company's latest demands. It was not prosperity, but it was life, and life finds a way to assert itself, even in the most controlled circumstances. At the end of the lane, in the house numbered 15, lived Arthur and Constance Vane. They were perhaps the most unremarkable couple on a street designed for uniformity, and yet they stood apart in one crucial way. They were childless, a fact that in a community where children represented both hope and economic necessity, marked them as objects of quiet sympathy rather than suspicion. Arthur Vane worked in the mill's accounting office, a position that afforded him slightly better hours and cleaner hands than his neighbors enjoyed. He was a small, neat man with thinning hair and wire-rimmed spectacles, the sort of person who seemed to fade into the background of any gathering. His clothes were always pressed, his shoes always polished, his manner always courteous but distant. Neighbors described him as helpful without being intrusive, the kind of man who would assist with a broken fence or a stuck window but never linger to chat afterward. Constance was more visible in the daily life of the lane, though no less enigmatic. She was a woman of perhaps 35 years, with dark hair always pinned in a severe bun, and a face that might have been beautiful if not for the perpetual sadness that seemed to cloud her features. What none suspected was that this sadness masked a deeper secret, a family bloodline that had been kept pure through generations of careful marriages between cousins. The Vane family tree had few branches, and fewer still that had not intertwined with themselves over the decades of isolation in the mountain valleys. Constance had a gift for preserving foods, and her pantry was legendary among the neighborhood women for its neat rows of pickled vegetables, fruit preserves, and smoked meats. During the harsh winter months, when fresh food became scarce, Constance would quietly leave jars on neighbors' doorsteps, never accepting payment or even acknowledgement for her generosity. What the recipients could not have known was that some of these delicacies contained ingredients that no decent pantry should ever house. The couple attended church services irregularly, citing Arthur's unpredictable work schedule. But when they did appear, they sat in the back pew and left immediately after the final hymn. Constance was often seen tending to a small flower garden behind their house, coaxing roses and lilies to bloom despite the valley's challenging climate. The garden was her one apparent indulgence, a riot of color and fragrance that seemed at odds with the couple's otherwise restrained existence. What endeared the Vanes most to their neighbors was their willingness to help during times of crisis. When old Mrs. Patterson fell ill during the winter of 1910, it was Constance who brought soup and sat vigil through the worst nights. When the Hendersons' youngest child developed a fever that lasted for weeks, Arthur quietly arranged for the company doctor to make additional visits without recording them on the family's account. They were the street's unofficial caretakers, the couple everyone could depend on, but no one really knew. In a community photograph taken during the summer picnic of 1911, the families of Elmira Lane are arranged in neat rows on the small patch of grass behind the church. Children sit cross-legged in front, women stand behind them with their hands on their husbands' shoulders, and the men tower in the back row, with the serious expressions befitting their roles as providers. At the very edge of the photograph, almost cropped out of the frame, Arthur and Constance Vane stand slightly apart from the others, their faces barely visible in the shadow cast by a large oak tree. They were the street's anchor, the one constant in a place where families came and went according to the mill's needs and fortunes. Perhaps this is why, when the disappearances began, no one thought to look too closely at the couple who had become as familiar and unremarkable as the cobblestones beneath their feet. In a town where survival depended on not asking too many questions, Arthur and Constance Vane had achieved something far more valuable than trust. They had achieved invisibility. The first crack in the carefully ordered world of Elmira Lane appeared on a gray November morning in 1911, when Margaret Henderson's washing failed to appear on the line between the maple saplings. It was such a small thing, but in a community where routine was survival, even the smallest deviation carried weight. Anna Miller noticed it first, glancing out her kitchen window as she kneaded dough. For 3 years, Margaret Henderson had hung her wash every Tuesday and Friday morning, precisely at 8 o'clock. The line had remained empty for 2 days now, and Anna felt a peculiar unease settling in her chest, like cold fog. When young Robert Miller walked past the Henderson house on his way to work, he noticed something far more troubling. The front door stood slightly ajar, revealing only darkness within. No smoke rose from the chimney, no lamplight flickered behind the windows, no sound of family life emerged from the structure that had once been filled with voices and laughter. By noon, word had spread through the lane like wildfire. Widow Clay had seen no movement from their house in 4 days. Milk bottles had begun accumulating on their doorstep, growing thick and sour in the November chill. Most unsettling of all, their tabby cat wandered the street, crying pitifully for food and attention. It was Arthur and Constance Vane who took action, as neighbors had come to expect. Arthur approached the Henderson door with his characteristic quiet confidence, calling out before stepping across the threshold. What he found inside defied explanation. The house was perfectly preserved, as if the family had simply stepped out for a brief errand. Breakfast dishes sat unwashed on the table. Work clothes hung neatly on pegs, and Sarah's red ribbon lay coiled on her small dresser like a sleeping snake. There were no signs of struggle, no indication of hasty packing, no evidence the Henderson family had planned to leave Blackwood Mills. Their possessions remained exactly where they had always been, beds unmade but not disturbed, and a pot of stew sat congealed on the cold stove, suggesting they had vanished during their evening meal. Arthur emerged with his face pale but composed, taking charge with calm efficiency. He suggested someone notify the mill superintendent while he and Constance looked after the Henderson property. Without being asked, Constance gathered the crying tabby into her arms, murmuring soft comfort as she carried it toward their own home. Mill Superintendent Rigby's assessment was swift and final. The Hendersons were runners, he declared, families who had accumulated debt and chosen to flee rather than face consequences. Sheriff Hale's reluctant investigation confirmed this conclusion. No signs of foul play, no evidence of outside interference, nothing more sinister than a family seeking their fortune elsewhere. Within a week, the Blackwood Ledger-Gazette published a brief article dismissing the Henderson disappearance as wandering fever, that restless condition afflicting working families who could not accept their station. The community accepted this explanation because it was easier than contemplating alternatives. But doubt lingered like smoke from a dying fire. Sarah Henderson's red ribbon remained on her dresser for weeks, visible through the window to anyone who cared to look. The first thread had been pulled from the carefully woven fabric of Elmira Lane, and although no one recognized it at the time, the entire tapestry had begun to quietly unravel. 3 months after the Henderson house fell silent, the Mills accounting office found itself in need of a new bookkeeper. The previous man had suffered what the company doctor diplomatically termed a nervous collapse, though those who worked closely with him whispered that he had become obsessed with discrepancies in the payroll records. Elias Thorne arrived in Blackwood Mills on a February morning when the snow lay thick enough to muffle even the mill whistle. He was a man of 28 years, thin and pale from too many hours bent over accounting books, carrying the quiet desperation of someone who had burned bridges and could not afford to fail again. The truth was that Elias had fled his previous position under circumstances involving a minor embezzlement scandal. Blackwood Mills represented his last chance at redemption, a position so remote that the mill owners were willing to overlook irregularities in his references. Superintendent Rigby assigned him lodging in the empty Henderson house on Elmira Lane. The house had been thoroughly cleaned, though a faint sweetness lingered in the kitchen that no amount of scrubbing could remove. Elias attributed it to the preserves he found in the pantry, jars someone had thoughtfully left for the new occupant. On his first evening, unpacking in what had been Sarah Henderson's bedroom, he noticed a child's red ribbon coiled in a dresser drawer. Rather than discard it, he placed it carefully in a wooden box with other forgotten items, possessions that spoke of lives interrupted rather than concluded. During his second week, Arthur and Constance Vane introduced themselves with characteristic quiet courtesy. They appeared at his door on Sunday evening, Arthur carrying medicinal whiskey and Constance bearing a covered pot filled with aromatic beef stew. The meal they shared was the first genuine warmth Elias had experienced since arriving in the valley. Constance proved an excellent cook, her stew seasoned with herbs and enriched with what she described as her special technique for preparing meat. Arthur, despite his reserved manner, was surprisingly well informed about mill operations. During conversation, Elias mentioned small inconsistencies he had noticed in payroll records, the same discrepancies that had driven his predecessor to distraction. Arthur listened with careful attention, occasionally asking clarifying questions that demonstrated his familiarity with the mill's financial systems. Constance changed the subject, warning Elias about newcomers who became overwhelmed by valley isolation. She spoke of employees who had succumbed to what she called the melancholy of the mountains, a condition affecting sensitive individuals unused to long winters and oppressive quiet. As they prepared to leave, Arthur mentioned they had looked after the Henderson property during the family's absence, ensuring nothing was damaged while the house stood empty. He suggested that if Elias ever needed assistance, he should not hesitate to call upon his neighbors. Over the following weeks, this pattern continued. Constance would appear with gifts of food, always perfectly prepared and seasoned with herbs that gave simple dishes unusual richness. Arthur would discuss mill business, his insights proving invaluable as Elias struggled to understand the complex web governing workers' lives. Arthur mentioned the unfortunate frequency with which families vanished from Blackwood Mills, abandoning homes without warning. He spoke of it as a predictable consequence of isolation and economic pressure, suggesting men of weak character would choose flight over responsibility when faced with difficulties. Elias recognized the names Arthur mentioned, families whose accounts had been closed with notations indicating they had left employment without notice. What struck him as odd was the meticulous care with which their financial obligations had been settled after disappearance, as if someone had taken responsibility for outstanding debts. But these were small concerns, easily explained by the company's desire to maintain orderly records. Elias had come to prove himself capable of managing accounts without becoming distracted by irregularities that probably had reasonable explanations. What he could not have imagined was that the numbers in his ledgers would soon tell a story more horrifying than any ghost tale, and that the couple who had welcomed him with such warmth were already planning how best to add his name to their growing collection. The pattern that would consume Elmira Lane had already begun before Elias Thorne ever set foot in the Henderson house, but it was during the spring of 1912 that it accelerated into something resembling an industrial process. What appeared to be tragic coincidence was, in reality, a methodical harvest orchestrated with the same precision Arthur Vane applied to his accounting ledgers. The Miller family vanished on a Thursday night in March, sometime between the evening mill whistle and dawn. James Miller had been seen leaving the lumber yard at his usual time, Anna Miller hanging washing on her line. Their teenage son Robert never reported for apprentice duties the following morning, and their daughter Mary's piano fell silent mid-practice session. By Friday afternoon, when milk bottles began accumulating and their mongrel dog wandered the lane with ribs showing, residents felt a chill that had nothing to do with mountain air. Yet again, Arthur and Constance Vane stepped forward to provide comfort and assistance. Arthur secured the Miller property while Constance gathered the starving dog with the same gentle care she had shown the Henderson cat. She murmured reassurances as she carried it home, where it would join the growing menagerie of abandoned pets that found their way to the Vane doorstep. Within days, observant neighbors noticed small changes that might have seemed innocent to anyone not already unnerved. Arthur was seen chopping wood with an axe that appeared newer and finer than his previous one, the blade gleaming with fresh oil, the handle bearing distinctive markings that James Miller had carved into his tools. Constance began airing bedding and clothing on her line, items clearly not her own, too large for her slight frame and too masculine for her wardrobe. When Widow Clay inquired, Constance explained she was sorting through items left by departed families, ensuring anything valuable would be preserved rather than abandoned to decay. Most unsettling was the expansion of Constance's renowned pantry. Her shelves began overflowing with new varieties of pickled vegetables, smoked meats, and sealed jars containing substances that defied identification. The sweet, smoky aroma from the Vane cellar grew stronger and more persistent, drifting through the lane even when no preservation work should have been taking place. When neighbors asked about her recipes, Constance would smile with quiet pride, speaking of traditional preservation techniques passed down through her family. The secret, she confided conspiratorially, lay in understanding that different types of meat required different approaches, and that the most tender results came from subjects properly prepared while still fresh. Arthur began wearing a coat that Miller family acquaintances immediately recognized as belonging to James. When questioned, he explained that departing families often left useful items that would otherwise waste. As unofficial caretakers of abandoned properties, he and Constance felt obligated to ensure serviceable items found new purposes. The community's response revealed the true genius of the veins methodology. In a town where survival depended on not asking uncomfortable questions, where challenging authority meant unemployment, and where the alternative to willful blindness was confronting horrible truths, residents chose to interpret what they saw benignly. The veins were helpful neighbors making the best of tragedy. They were practical people preventing waste. They were anchors of stability when families vanished like smoke in mountain wind. To question their motives would question the only source of comfort remaining in their fragile community. But beneath this carefully constructed normalcy, other changes would have chilled anyone bold enough to investigate. The cellar beneath the vein house had been expanded through winter excavation. New shelving-lined walls, hooks hung from ceiling beams, and Arthur had constructed a workshop complete with specialized tools and small containers designed for delicate, precise work. If this is your first time here, subscribe so you don't miss the truths history tried to bury. The system Arthur and Constance had devised was perfect in its simplicity, hidden in plain sight like the most effective deceptions. Each disappearance made the next easier to explain away, each tragedy providing cover for the systematic consumption of an entire community. The most efficient predators convince their prey to participate in their own destruction, and the veins had turned Elmira Lane into a feeding ground where survivors would defend their predators rather than acknowledge the horror unfolding in their midst. Their perfect system would continue unchallenged until a simple accounting error brought the entire grotesque enterprise crashing down. Martha Clay had been knitting for 63 years, her fingers working the needles with mechanical precision while she watched the street from her kitchen window. She knitted through conversations at the company store and through long mountain evenings when fog swallowed the lane in gray silence. It was this lifetime of observation that made Martha Clay the first person in Blackwood Mills to understand what was truly happening on Elmira Lane. Her black wool grew steadily into funeral shawls as her sharp eyes cataloged details that others dismissed entirely. She had watched Arthur Vane carry heavy bundles wrapped in canvas from his cellar to his garden shed during the deepest hours of night. She had observed Constance scrubbing her kitchen floor with desperate intensity, trying to remove stains that ordinary cleaning could never eliminate. Most damning, she had seen the smoke rising from their chimney during hours when no cooking should occur, thick and sweet with an aroma that reminded her of the slaughterhouse where her late husband once worked. But Martha Clay was a widow with no family connections to protect her position, and she understood that accusations without proof were the fastest way to join the disappeared. So she knitted and watched and waited for someone with authority to listen. When Elias Thorne emerged from the mill office on a rainy April evening, she intercepted him with careful timing. Her approach was indirect, beginning with weather pleasantries but gradually steering toward the troubling changes she had witnessed. She spoke of the Henderson cat, now fat and sleek in the Vane household, despite near starvation when they took it in. She mentioned the Miller dog, which displayed similar transformation in weeks. What disturbed her most was not the animal's recovery, but the speed of their adaptation. Martha's voice dropped as she described items in the Vane's possession that longtime residents would recognize as belonging to vanished families. Thomas Henderson's distinctive pipe, which Arthur now smoked, Margaret Henderson's blue shawl, which Constance wore to the store days after the disappearance, James Miller's work boots, polished and worn by Arthur despite being too large. When Elias suggested charitable donations or practical use of abandoned property, Martha fixed him with the steady gaze of someone who had lived long enough to recognize evil in a familiar face. She spoke of the nauseating smell drifting from their cellar at all hours, strongest when preservation work should have finished. She described construction sounds throughout winter, rhythmic hammering suggesting major modifications to the foundation. Martha revealed she had been keeping detailed records of the family's possessions as they appeared in the vein's daily use, noting dates and circumstances with methodical precision. Her knitting basket contained more than yarn. Hidden beneath lay pages of observations documenting systematic looting of the disappeared. But Martha's final revelation struck Elias like a physical blow. She had noticed payroll discrepancies, irregularities apparent only to someone who paid attention to which men reported for work. Thomas Henderson's wages continued 3 weeks after his family vanished. James Miller's pay was collected over a month following his disappearance. Someone with access to financial systems was fraudulently obtaining compensation for men no longer capable of earning it. Elias felt his blood turn to ice as Martha's words connected with his suspicions about the ledgers that had troubled his predecessor. The accounting discrepancies were not clerical errors or traditional embezzlement. They were proof that someone in Blackwood Mills was profiting from the dead. As Martha rose to leave, her knitting needles clicking with renewed urgency, she offered final advice wrapped in practical wisdom. If he chose to investigate, he should prepare for the possibility that truth was far worse than simple fraud. Some hungers, she observed with grim certainty, could never be satisfied by ordinary means. The numbers on his pages would no longer lie dormant, waiting to be explained by convenient theories. They pointed with mathematical precision toward the most respectable house on Elmira Lane. And Elias finally understood that his ledgers contained evidence of crimes stretching far beyond wage theft. The widow's knitting needles had woven together a tapestry of horror that could no longer be dismissed, and the trembling finger of accounting truth pointed directly at Arthur and Constance Vane. The revelation struck Elias like a physical blow as he returned to the mill office that evening, Martha Clay's words echoing with the persistence of a funeral bell. The payroll ledgers that had driven his predecessor to nervous collapse suddenly took on sinister significance, transforming what he had dismissed as clerical errors into evidence of something far more disturbing. Working by lamplight, Elias spread the company records across his desk with the methodical precision of someone conducting an autopsy. Pages that once seemed filled with mundane details now read like a catalog of the dead, each entry marked with wages earned by men who could no longer collect them. Thomas Henderson's name appeared in payroll records for 3 weeks following his family's disappearance, wages marked as collected but with no signature or verification. James Miller's entries continued over a month after his family's last sighting, compensation noted as distributed despite obvious impossibility. Most damning, both accounts showed the same distinctive marking, a small X, written in different ink that appeared nowhere else in company records. The pattern became clear as Elias traced these markings through months of entries, discovering additional names corresponding to families whose disappearances had been explained as voluntary departures. In each case, wages continued being collected weeks or months after workers vanished, and each fraudulent transaction bore the same mysterious mark. When Elias examined authorization signatures for these payments, the full horror became apparent. The handwriting was unmistakably familiar, the careful script of someone maintaining precise financial records. Arthur Vane had systematically constructed a method for profiting from his neighbors' deaths, using his position to transform murder into sustainable income. Armed with this evidence, Elias understood he faced a choice determining not only his fate, but potentially everyone remaining on Elmira Lane. He could remain silent, allowing the Vanes to continue their harvest, or risk everything by bringing discoveries to someone with authority to act. The decision was easier knowing his own name would inevitably appear on the Vanes' target list. As bookkeeper, he possessed both access to sensitive information and the isolation that made previous victims vulnerable. His continued existence represented a threat they would soon be compelled to eliminate. The following morning, Elias requested urgent meeting with Superintendent Rigby, carrying damning ledger pages and written summary of findings. He expected skepticism, perhaps anger at accusations against respected community members. Instead, he encountered fury directed at himself. Rigby's reaction was explosive, face flushing as he slammed his fist onto the desk, scattering papers. The accusations were preposterous, desperate fabrications from someone covering his own incompetence. Arthur Vane was a trusted employee with exemplary service, not some penny dreadful monster. More disturbing than anger was Rigby's intimate knowledge of Elias's employment troubles, confidential details recited with precision. The embezzlement scandal, gambling debts, desperate circumstances bringing him to Blackwood Mills were laid bare as evidence of unreliability and criminal tendencies. Rigby's rejection wasn't based on disbelief, but calculation. Mill operations depended on maintaining order and preventing workforce panic. Investigations would disrupt productivity, attract outside attention, potentially damage company reputation. Better to silence the messenger than acknowledge the message. When Elias persisted, producing additional evidence, Rigby shifted to direct threat. The mill employed dozens of bookkeepers throughout the territory. Finding replacement would be simple. Someone with Elias's past would struggle securing employment elsewhere, particularly with unfavorable references regarding mental stability. But Elias anticipated this response, playing his final card with desperate courage. If the mill wouldn't investigate these irregularities, perhaps outside authorities would show interest in evidence of systematic fraud and potential murder in a company town operating beyond normal law enforcement reach. The threat of external investigation penetrated Rigby's corporate arrogance where moral arguments failed. Federal authorities were taking increasing interest in isolated company towns, and any criminal activity suggestion could result in oversight that mill owners had spent decades avoiding. Faced with this ultimatum, Rigby grudgingly agreed to present evidence to Sheriff Hale, though making clear Elias would bear full responsibility for consequences. If investigation found no wrongdoing, the bookkeeper would face immediate termination and possible criminal charges for false statements against respectable citizens. As Elias left with ledger pages tucked securely under his arm, he understood he had crossed a line from which there could be no retreat. The numbers in his records had become weapons in a war he never intended to fight, revealing truth far worse than mere theft. Mathematical precision had pointed with undeniable accuracy toward the house at Elmira Lane's end, and now it remained to be seen whether justice could move as swiftly as hunger in the mountains of Blackwood Mills. Sheriff Josiah Hale approached the Vane house with reluctant steps, his pronounced limp more noticeable in the gathering dusk as he made his way down Elmira Lane with Elias Thorne at his side. The ledger pages in his coat pocket represented more than financial fraud evidence. They challenged the carefully maintained order that allowed Blackwood Mills to function beyond outside scrutiny. The house at number 15 appeared exactly as always, a model of domestic tranquility mocking the accusations in Elias's documentation. Lamplight glowed behind lace curtains, smoke rose peacefully from the chimney, and the garden showed careful attention that made Constance Vane's flowers the envy of every woman on the lane. Arthur Vane answered their knock with the same quiet courtesy that had endeared him to neighbors for years. Dressed in neat attire with spectacles perched precisely, his manner suggested genuine puzzlement at an evening visit from law enforcement. Behind him, the house interior radiated spotless cleanliness that had always marked the Vane household as respectability's beacon. Sheriff Hale began diplomatically, apologizing for the intrusion and explaining routine inquiries into mill administrative irregularities. Arthur listened with patient attention, occasionally nodding and offering assistance to resolve the matter. Only when the sheriff mentioned specific payroll discrepancies did Arthur's composure show the first hairline crack. His hand tightened imperceptibly on the door frame, eyes shifting briefly toward Elias before returning to the lawman's face. The change was subtle, transformation from puzzled cooperation to wary calculation. From within the house came sounds of Constance's evening routines, gentle dish clinks and soft footsteps, tidying already immaculate rooms. But beneath these domestic sounds, both visitors detected something else, a faint but persistent aroma, oddly out of place in crisp mountain air. It was sweet and cloying, with an underlying metallic note that made throats tighten involuntarily. When Sheriff Hale produced ledger pages and spread them on the door's small table, Arthur's reaction was controlled surprise mastery. He examined documents with professional interest, finger-tracing questionable entries while offering reasonable explanations for apparent administrative oversights. Henderson's wages were likely delayed paperwork processing, failing to reflect the family's timely departure. Miller's payments could be explained by confusion over final work schedule and accumulated over time. Such errors were regrettable but hardly unusual in complex company operations. Elias pressed the crucial question, asking Arthur to explain the distinctive X markings on all fraudulent transactions. For the first time, Arthur's facade showed genuine cracks, hand moving instinctively to adjust spectacles while his mind visibly worked constructing plausible explanation. The markings were simply filing systems, methods for tracking payments requiring additional verification. As someone with financial records access, he occasionally assisted with administrative tasks outside normal duties, particularly when regular bookkeepers were overwhelmed or absent. But inconsistencies became apparent to both listeners. Timing didn't align with known absences. Markings appeared on no other verification requiring transactions, and most damning, handwriting authorization on fraudulent payments was unmistakably his careful script. From deeper within came a new sound, making all three men freeze. Muffled but unmistakable, rhythmic thudding of something heavy moving across wooden floor, followed by metal scraping stone. The noise lasted moments before stopping abruptly, leaving silence that throbbed with unspoken tension. Arthur's explanation came too quickly, words tumbling in sharp contrast to his usual measured speech. Constance was rearranging cellar furniture, moving preserved goods for spring preparations. She was meticulous about organization, often working late evenings ensuring proper arrangement. But Sheriff Hale had heard enough evasions. Years of reluctant law enforcement taught him when diplomatic inquiry must give way to official authority. He informed Arthur that formal premises search would be necessary to resolve payroll investigation questions. Cooperation greatly appreciated, though not strictly required. Arthur Vane's mask finally slipped completely, revealing something neither visitor was prepared to encounter. The quiet, helpful neighbor transformed before their eyes into someone calculating and dangerous, mild-mannered facade, dissolving to expose the predator hiding beneath years of carefully maintained respectability. The cellar door, Arthur declared with sudden firmness, was locked and would remain so. The area contained nothing beyond preserved foods and household supplies, materials that would be damaged by unnecessary handling and outside air exposure. Any search required proper warrant, and he was certain the sheriff lacked both authority and justification for such extreme measures. As the three men stood facing each other in the doorway of Elmira Lane's anchor of stability, the sweet, cloying aroma grew stronger, rising from beneath their feet like breath of something feeding in darkness for far too long. None could have imagined that the horror about to be uncovered was not simple hunger or ordinary madness, but something far more twisted, a grotesque parody of love that had consumed an entire community in service of the most pathetic and monstrous of human needs. Sheriff Hale's patience had reached its limit. Arthur Vane's refusal to allow cellar access transformed diplomatic inquiry into urgent official business. With authority granted by his badge and suspicions raised by months of unexplained disappearances, cooperation was no longer optional. The confrontation revealed true character hiding beneath years of respectability. Arthur's mild manner evaporated completely, replaced by something calculating and desperate that made both visitors step back involuntarily. But desperation was no match for legal authority, backed by growing certainty that terrible crimes had been committed. When Sheriff Hale produced his heavy keyring and selected the universal lockpick, Arthur's resistance crumbled with sudden finality. His shoulders sagged, hands trembled, and for the first time since their arrival, careful composure abandoned him completely. The cellar door, finally opened, released an aroma so powerful and nauseating that all three men recoiled as if struck. It was not merely the sweet, cloying scent detected earlier, but something far more complex and disturbing. Beneath surface sweetness lay unmistakable decay, but decay carefully managed and transformed into something defying categorization. Elias descended the wooden steps first, his accounting mind automatically cataloging details, even as his stomach rebelled. The cellar had been extensively modified from simple storage space, walls lined with new lumber, floor covered with stained boards visible in dim lamplight, ceiling fitted with iron hooks gleaming dully in flickering illumination. But the modifications themselves did not strike visitors with paralyzing horror. It was what those modifications accommodated. The cellar had become a workshop, but a workshop dedicated to crafts no decent mind could conceive. Along one wall, shelving held what appeared to be preserved specimens, but these were not familiar pickled vegetables and fruit preserves that had made Constance's pantry enviable. These containers held things that had once been human, body parts cleaned and prepared with the same meticulous care Constance applied to domestic arts. Bones had been sorted by size and type, cleaned until they gleamed white as snow, arranged with organization speaking of genuine pride in work, ribs separated from vertebrae, skulls positioned by age and size, smaller hand and foot bones catalogued with medical school precision. But true horror lay not in systematic butchery these remains represented, but in what had been done afterward. In the cellar center, surrounded by grotesque craft tools and materials, stood a makeshift nursery challenging every assumption about human nature and sanity boundaries. Small figures had been constructed from cleaned bones, assembled with wire and sinew into human-child approximations. Each figure carefully crafted to represent specific individuals, identifiable by preserved and incorporated features. Sarah Henderson's distinctive red ribbon tied around the smallest figure's skull, scraps of missing children's clothing dressing bone dolls in tragic parodies of former owners. But bone children were not merely trophies or grotesque souvenirs. They had been arranged in domestic scenes speaking of pathetic and disturbing human longings. Tiny chairs constructed for skeletal figures, tables set with miniature dishes, entire arrangement positioned as if bone children engaged in family activities Arthur and Constance never experienced with their own children. From darkness beyond lamplight came weeping sounds, not theatrical sobs of wrongdoing discovery, but genuine grief of someone whose cherished dreams had been exposed in monstrous reality. Constance Vane emerged from shadows like a haunting ghost, face streaked with tears, hands covered in unidentifiable substances. Her words carried confession weight, explaining everything and justifying nothing. She spoke of barren years, empty rooms that should have held children's laughter, desperate longing slowly transforming into something even she recognized as unspeakable. They had tried building a family, she whispered through tears, tried creating love and happiness. Nature denied through her inability to bear children. The neighbors had been generous, she continued, with fractured logic of severed reality grip. They had provided everything needed to construct the family biology refused to grant. Each disappeared child became part of their household, transformed through Constance's preservation skills into eternal companions who would never grow up and leave them, never disappoint them, never abandon them to crushing loneliness driving these desperate measures. What she did not confess, what the evidence in that charnel house made clear, was that the Vanes' isolation had made their family blood run dangerously pure. Generations of cousins marrying cousins in the mountain valleys had twisted their minds as surely as it had marked their features. The childlessness that drove them to these horrors was itself the product of inbreeding that had made natural reproduction impossible, their bodies as corrupted as their souls. As Sheriff Hale and Elias stood frozen in horror at revelation of what human longing could become when twisted by isolation and desperate need, Constance knelt among her bone children and wailed with grief of someone whose precious possessions had been discovered and would soon be taken away forever. In that moment, the monsters became something else entirely. They became broken people whose crimes were no less horrific for being motivated by fundamental human needs, the desire to love and be loved, to create family and find meaning in caring for others. The tragedy was not that they were evil, but that they were human, and their humanity had been corrupted into something feeding on destruction of everything they claimed to cherish. The machinery of institutional cover-up began moving within hours of the discovery, with swift efficiency of an organization that had perfected making inconvenient truths disappear. By dawn, Mill Superintendent Rigby arrived with company men, their faces grim, knowing what they witnessed could destroy everything the mill owners had built. The decision to suppress the full horror came not from sympathy for Arthur and Constance Vane, but from cold calculation of men who understood certain truths were too dangerous to acknowledge. A company town that had harbored cannibalistic murders would become a scandal reaching distant newspapers, attracting federal investigators, ultimately resulting in scrutiny that isolated industrial operations could not survive. Arthur and Constance were quietly removed before sunrise, transported not to county jail where crimes would become public record, but to a private asylum whose administrators understood discretion's value. Official records would show they had suffered simultaneous mental breakdowns from isolation and valley pressure, requiring immediate treatment at facilities equipped for such tragic cases. The bone nursery and grotesque contents were dismantled with the same systematic efficiency the Vanes had applied to construction. Every fragment was catalogued not for criminal evidence, but for complete destruction, ensuring no physical proof remained. The preserved remains were collected and transported to mill furnaces, where they would be reduced to ash and mixed with sawdust, feeding legitimate business fires. Sheriff Hale found himself presented with a choice defining his remaining law enforcement career. He could pursue full investigation exposing the truth about Elmira Lane disappearances, knowing such revelations would likely result in his removal from office and destruction of the only stable community he had known, or accept the company's version and help maintain fiction, allowing life to continue with minimal disruption. The sheriff chose pragmatism over principle, a decision haunting his remaining years, but seeming the only rational response to impossible circumstances. His official report described the Vanes as a couple succumbing to mental strain of childlessness and isolation, whose disturbed behavior required immediate psychiatric intervention. Elias Thorne received more direct institutional pressure. Within a week, he was summoned to Rigby's office and presented with generous severance, including substantial cash payment, glowing recommendations, and immediate transportation to a distant territory position. The offer came with implicit understanding that continued silence was not merely requested but required. The houses on Elmira Lane were demolished within the month, destruction explained as necessary. Public health measures following contagious fever outbreak claiming multiple families. Dr. Finch provided scientific authority for this explanation, his credentials lending credibility to a story transforming murder victims into disease casualties. By 1912's end, Elmira Lane had been erased from both physical landscape and official records. Maps were redrawn showing vacant company land designated for future development, administrative files containing no references to families who had once lived and died there. Within 5 years, newcomers would have no way of knowing 13 families had ever existed in that corner of the company town. But the most efficient cover-up could not erase every trace of what had occurred, and the ground itself would eventually reveal secrets that human authority had tried desperately to bury. The mill whistle fell silent for the final time in 1947, its last shriek echoing off valley walls like the death cry of some ancient beast finally succumbing to decades-old wounds. The timber had been exhausted, profits extracted, and corporate owners moved operations to forests not yet stripped bare by industrial machinery. Blackwood mills joined the growing ranks of abandoned company towns scattered across American wilderness, places where human ambition had burned bright before consuming itself, leaving only empty buildings and unwanted memories. Remaining residents dispersed like autumn leaves, carrying memory fragments that would fade until survivors could no longer distinguish what they had witnessed from what they had dreamed. By 1960, the last company housing had succumbed to weather and neglect, wooden walls returning to earth from which they had been carved. The mill became a monument to industrial decay, machinery rusting into abstract sculptures speaking of human enterprise transformed into cautionary art. Nature began reclaiming what had been taken, sending vines up rotting walls and saplings into abandoned foundation cracks. But the ground where Elmira Lane had stood remained strangely resistant to natural resurrection. Decades after company lime treatment and systematic evidence removal, soil in that valley corner showed odd reluctance to support new growth. Grass would sprout in spring only to wither before summer heat, and few trees that established themselves grew twisted and stunted as if drawing nutrients from fundamentally poisoned earth. The first modern visitors arrived in the 1980s, urban explorers and photographers drawn by romantic decay of abandoned industrial sites. They found beauty in rust and ruin, transforming Blackwood Mills bones into art celebrating human failure aesthetics. But even these fearless forgotten place explorers reported uneasiness when walking across empty fields where no buildings had ever stood according to their maps. A university metal detector enthusiast made the first significant discovery in 1993. Electronic equipment registering anomalies beneath barren soil, suggesting metallic objects at unusual burial depths. What he unearthed was a collection of small items, telling stories official records claimed never existed. A child's copper button, woman's wedding ring, man's pocket watch stopped at 11:27 on an unknown evening decades past. But bone fragments truly challenged sanitized Blackwood Mills history, scattered throughout soil at depths, suggesting deliberate burial rather than natural accumulation. These remnants defied rational explanation. They were clearly human remains, but processed in ways university anthropologists struggled to classify, using conventional forensic terminology. Some bones showed evidence of careful cleaning and modification, speaking of purposes beyond mere evidence disposal. drill holes made with precision, suggesting tools more sophisticated than typically available to early 20th century rural residents. Scrape marks indicated systematic tissue removal, using techniques combining butchery and craftsmanship elements in ways modern investigators found deeply disturbing. Modern visitors began reporting phenomena defying rational explanation. Photographs often showed unexpected shadows and light anomalies, suggesting figures invisible to naked eyes when images were captured. Audio recordings captured sounds resembling children's laughter mixed with adult voices in conversational tones too faint for understanding but clear enough to be undeniably human. Thermal imaging revealed cold spots corresponding exactly to bone fragment discovery locations, as if Earth maintained memory of what had been buried there. Temperature anomalies persisted regardless of weather or seasonal changes, suggesting environmental factors unexplainable by conventional meteorology or geology. The most persistent reports came from investigators detecting lingering aroma that had once emanated from the vein cellar, a sweet and cloying scent appearing without warning and disappearing just as suddenly, leaving only memory of something that should not have existed in empty fields where nothing had grown for decades. In the end, when all testimonies have been dismissed as folklore and physical evidence explained away by experts who were not there to witness what the ground remembers, one document remains that cannot be contested or rationalized by those preferring comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. The payroll ledger of Blackwood Mills, archived in county records and forgotten except by persistent researchers, still bears distinctive X markings that Arthur Vane inscribed beside names of men no longer alive to collect wages. Modern forensic handwriting analysis confirms what Elias Thorne recognized in that lamplight accounting office over a century ago. Fraudulent entries were authorized by someone with intimate mill financial system knowledge and unquestioned access to official documentation. Thomas Henderson's name appears in payroll records 3 weeks after his family's disappearance, each entry marked with telltale symbols, speaking of systematic deception carried out with bureaucratic precision. James Miller's wages were collected over a month following his vanishing, payments recorded with the same methodical care Arthur Vane applied to all professional responsibilities. But the ledger contains more than financial fraud evidence. Careful examination reveals additional names, workers whose disappearances were so thoroughly covered up that no other record of their existence survived company erasure of inconvenient history. The X markings appear beside dozens of entries spanning several months, suggesting Henderson and Miller families were merely the most visible casualties in a harvest consuming far more victims than anyone understood. The implications are staggering and undeniable. If Arthur Vane was fraudulently collecting wages for dead men, then Arthur Vane was killing those men. If bone fragments found in modern Blackwood Mills soil show evidence of the same processing techniques discovered in the Vane cellar, then their crimes extended far beyond what even horrified witnesses imagined. Modern investigators estimate that Arthur and Constance Vane may have been responsible for as many as 50 deaths, individuals systematically murdered, processed, and transformed into the grotesque family that their barren marriage had denied them. The bone nursery represented only a fraction of their crimes, preserved remains of victims selected for permanent commemoration rather than simple consumption. The truth emerging from evidence fragments is more horrible than any ghost story or urban legend. Arthur and Constance Vane were not penny dreadful monsters, but human beings whose fundamental need for family and belonging had been twisted by isolation and desperation into something feeding on destruction of everything they claimed to love. They were ordinary people who became extraordinary predators, individuals whose surface respectability allowed them to operate with impunity in a community choosing willful blindness over acknowledging truths too terrible to confront. Their crimes were enabled not by supernatural evil, but by the human tendency to explain away evidence, challenging comfortable assumptions about neighborly behavior. The payroll ledger stands as testament to truth that corporate power spent decades burying. Arthur and Constance Vane systematically murdered neighbors and profited from their deaths, using bureaucratic normalcy machinery to transform monstrous crimes into routine administrative transactions. Some stories are buried not because they are untrue, but because the truth they contain is a weight too heavy for any community to bear, without questioning everything it believes about human nature and the bonds that hold civilization together. Reflection: the weight of truth. The story of Arthur and Constance Vane forces us to confront the most uncomfortable truths about evil in our world. It would be easier to dismiss them as monsters, aberrations removed from normal human experience. But evidence suggests something more disturbing. They were ordinary people whose fundamental needs became twisted into something feeding on destruction of everything they claimed to cherish. Their neighbors saw them as pillars of respectability, helpful community members struggling to survive in an isolated environment. The tragedy is not that evil wore goodness's mask, but that goodness itself became corrupted when filtered through desperate loneliness of two people denied what they believed was their basic right to family and belonging. Elmira Lane residents were not fools for failing to recognize predators among them. They were human beings doing what humans have always done when confronted with evidence challenging fundamental assumptions about safety and community. They explained it away, rationalized it, chose familiar lies over unthinkable truths. We tell ourselves such things could not happen today, that our systems would prevent cannibalistic killers from operating with impunity. But Blackwood Mills reminds us that effective predators exploit the very systems designed to protect us, transforming our desire for normalcy into weapons against our survival. The mill owners covering up Vane crimes were not evil men protecting evil deeds. They were pragmatic businessmen making calculated decisions about reputation and stability. The sheriff choosing silence was not a coward, but a man preserving the only functioning community he had known. Survivors accepting the official story were not willfully blind, but desperate people clinging to hope that their world still made sense. Perhaps the most chilling lesson: ordinary human motivations combined with isolation, desperation, and institutional power create conditions where monstrous crimes become not only possible, but inevitable. The true horror was not that Elmira Lane harbored monsters, but that it revealed how easily any of us might become complicit in unspeakable acts when the alternative is confronting truths too terrible to process. If you found yourself drawn to this story through all its dark revelations and uncomfortable truths, perhaps you recognize something essential about the human condition in the tragedy that unfolded in that forgotten valley. Subscribe so you don't miss the other buried histories waiting to be unearthed. Stories that challenge everything we think we know about the capacity for both good and evil lying dormant in every human heart. The ground remembers what we choose to forget, and sometimes the most important stories are those we are most reluctant to tell.